Oh dear, it seems I've been caught. But, your husband is now mine alone. Get it and hurry up with the divorce. I, who had stumbled upon my younger sister, Mariana, and my husband, Steve, in an affair, confronted my sister resolutely despite being shaken. However, my husband was adamant about divorcing and left home with my sister. I decided not to mix personal issues with work, but since the president of the company where I work is my father-in-law, it didn't take long for him to notice something was wrong. When I opened up about everything, he was furious with my husband's actions and planned revenge. Yet, 2 years later, my father-in-law passed away. Enter my ex-husband and sister, smugly arriving for the inheritance, but my father-in-law's revenge plan triggered an unbelievable outcome. When I was over 30, the president of the company I worked for took a liking to me and arranged a meeting with his son. Initially, I refused, but the president was very fond of my work and character, and insisted that I marry his son. He even said it was okay to refuse if I didn't like him, so I agreed to the meeting to honor the president. Meeting him, I was drawn to his bright, pure, straightforward nature, incapable of lying. After a few dates, we decided to get married. 5 years have passed since then, and I'm in my late 30s. I feel like these next few years are crucial if we're going to have children. But my husband says there's no need to rush. A childless life together isn't bad either. His easygoing nature, along with our flexible approach to marriage, lessened my sense of obligation to have children. Instead, we cherished each other and led a happy married life. My husband is an only child, but I have a younger sister, Mariana, who is 10 years younger. With such an age gap, I often felt more motherly towards her. I prefer a stable and modest lifestyle, while Mariana is the opposite, living for the moment and not worrying about the future. This mindset is fine as a student, but questionable as an adult. I once bluntly told her she needs to take responsibility for her life, especially as our parents age. Naturally, this caused a rift between us. My sisters and I weren't on good terms even before that, so needless to say, that argument caused us to grow further apart. Mariana's flashy lifestyle and like-minded friends used to disrupt our family home. Eventually, I moved out and started living alone. Later, I met my husband, Steve, through an arranged meeting. Despite being in her late 20s, Mariana was still living a carefree life. When I moved into my new home with Steve, Mariana started visiting frequently. Initially hesitant, she soon became a regular, to the point of overstaying her welcome. I tolerated her visits, not wanting to strain my marriage. I didn't want to spoil our relationship between husband and wife by making a lot of comments. Steve often sided with Mariana, even when I knew she was being unreasonable. I wanted Steve to be on my side. One day, 5 years into our marriage, Mariana unexpectedly visited on a weekday night. She usually visited on weekends, likely because Steve spoiled her. Of course, my husband pampers her, so that's what she's aiming for. Concerned, I asked why she came. Mariana had a big fight with our parents and left home. She didn't want to return, claiming they interfered with her life. I intended to support her ambitions, thinking our parents opposed them. But the truth was different. Approaching 30, Mariana still doesn't have a steady job and won't contribute to living expenses. When our parents asked her to at least help around the house since she can't pay, they ended up arguing. They want me to convince Mariana to come back home. They know she won't listen to me, though. Probably, they're hoping my husband Steve could persuade her. When Steve returned, I urged Mariana to go back and talk to our parents. But my sister doesn't want to go home and complains that she wants to stay here for a while. She refused, pleading with Steve instead. It seemed she was more interested in persuading my husband than me. If you say so, Steve, my sister will listen. After all, it's your house, right? You have the say here, don't you? Sure, the house is in Steve's name, but I contribute to the living expenses too. I thought it was unfair to rely solely on Steve's decision. Steve knows I pay part of the bills. I trusted him not to make a decision alone and waited for his response. But my hopes were dashed in an instant. Sure, let's live together. He casually agreed to Mariana moving in. Mariana and Steve seemed to have similar tastes, getting friendlier every time they met, making me feel almost jealous of their closeness. Mariana knew how to charm Steve and keep him in a good mood. I never made Steve angry, but his expression was clearly different when Mariana was around. Mariana quit her part-time job soon after moving in, claiming it was too hard to commute from our house. She said she'd look for something nearby, but there was no sign she was even trying. Instead, she dumped all the housework on me when I got home from my full-time job.
You're home all day, so you should handle the housework, right? I'm tired from job hunting. Besides, I'm taking care of Steve, so it's only natural for you, who has more free time, to do the housework.
Mariana was like a doting new wife, taking care of Steve. Welcome home, Steve. Shower first or beer? Dinner's not ready yet. My sister has been slow. She knew there was no bathroom cleaned or cold beer ready, yet she said that. Then she'd call me an incompetent wife. Steve didn't help, just laughing at our exchanges. You sisters get along so well. How can anyone think we're getting along when Mariana is clearly dissing me? How do you think we're good friends? I was boiling inside. But I didn't lash out at Steve or Mariana because I didn't want to ruin my marriage. I still had some faith in Steve, thinking he just wanted to be on Mariana's side because he felt sorry for her. Then, my father-in-law fell ill and was hospitalized. As a manager, I was informed, so there were quite a few employees visiting him. The hospital provided complete nursing, so there was no need for family to be constantly there. Still, I visited him every day after work, staying until the end of visiting hours. He worried if I was too busy with work and home. Despite his own health issues, he was such a kind person. But Steve didn't visit, claiming he was too busy with work. I tried to get him to see his father, but he wouldn't listen, too busy with various commitments. One of which was going out with Mariana. I begged him to stop by, even for a little while, but it was no use. If you're so concerned, you take care of Dad. As if I wasn't already. Feeling guilty for not getting Steve to visit, I spent even more time taking care of my father-in-law. This meant Steve and Mariana spent more time alone at home. They grew closer while I was away. Even when I was home, they were always together, acting like a couple or newlyweds, especially when Steve took Mariana to the new mall. And yet, I couldn't ask Steve to stop being so close with Mariana. Not only was she staying with us, but Steve was also covering her share of the living expenses. I once offered to bear the cost, but since it was Steve who allowed it, he's the one paying. However, I couldn't speak up against him because I'm adding to his burden. This went on for about 3 months until one day. I was so busy that I forgot some important documents at home for a meeting. Planning to use my lunch break to go back home and fetch them, I left work. But as luck would have it, I was swamped and couldn't leave until later. While I did tell my staff to take their full hour for lunch, I took a late break and went home. There, I stumbled upon a shocking scene. I expected Mariana to be home alone on a weekday afternoon. But there was Steve on the living room sofa, in the midst of an affair with Mariana. Too engrossed to notice my return. My heart raced and hands trembled with shock. But I knew I needed evidence, so I took photos with my phone. When they changed positions, Mariana noticed me. She provocatively urged Steve on, not caring that I was watching. Steve, seeing me reflected in the window, looked guilty. His desire seemed to have vanished, but Mariana was undeterred, suggesting they continue to spite me. Steve's mine now. You're so clueless for not noticing anything these past 3 months. If you loved him, you would have noticed, right? Mariana mocked me, implying my ignorance meant I didn't love Steve.
How could I not notice? If it weren't for you moving in, I would have spoken up to my husband.
I blamed Mariana, believing if she left, Steve would come back to his senses. I wanted to lash out more. But my inherent earnestness prevented it. It wasn't just one person's fault in an affair. Even if Mariana seduced him, Steve chose to respond. Knowing this, I still targeted only Mariana.
You've always been the same. You take what you want, regardless of who you hurt. How many people have you upset?
I was probably at the top of that list. Mariana always got what she wanted, while I hesitated and thought things through. Only to find she had already taken them. I don't know how she came up with the money, but I'm sure she begged the older boyfriend she was dating at the time. That's the case even now. She approached Steve, not because we were close, but because he was the son of a wealthy company president. She laughed off my anger, calling me foolish for being outsmarted. Steve then spoke up for the first time.
You're also unaware of how you belittle and look down on people. Do you even realize it?
He confessed being with me was painful, and Mariana was his escape. He thought I was perfect and unforgiving. A cold, machine-like person. Even though my husband is the next company president, my father-in-law always relies on me. He resented my presence, as his father always relied on me, making him feel redundant. I was astonished Steve felt this way. I'm divorcing you. It's suffocating being with you. He said he would leave with Mariana.
If you do that, I'll sue both of you for alimony. Absolutely not. Why should we pay you anything?
Steve agreed with Mariana, threatening to cut ties with his father and quit the company if I demanded alimony. If Steve, the future company president, leaves the business, it won't survive. Even now, there are board members grumbling about what the next president is doing.
You can't do it, can you? You feel too much gratitude towards my father, the current president, to put him in a difficult position.
Steve was right. I owe my current position to my father-in-law, the company's president. Plus, if he learns about this, it might worsen his illness. The emotional shock would be too much. I understood more than anyone that this wasn't the time to be assertive. Mariana walked past me, smirking, while I stood there unable to respond. Steve passed by in silence, and I heard the front door close behind them. They left hand in hand. I couldn't bring myself to tell my father-in-law about Steve and Mariana, so I pretended as if nothing had happened. I knew he would find out eventually, but I decided to keep it hidden at least until he was discharged from the hospital. A few days later, Steve sent me divorce papers, with a hastily scribbled note of a lawyer's contact information. Not contacting felt like a form of resistance. I thought about discussing it with my father-in-law after his discharge, but after calming down, I realized I didn't miss Steve as much as I thought. My only concern was repaying the kindness shown by my father-in-law. I didn't want to cause him any more trouble. So, feeling it was wrong to hesitate, I decided to contact the lawyer to proceed with our divorce. I carried the divorce papers with me, planning to visit the lawyer after visiting my father-in-law at the hospital. I tried to act normal, but he noticed my lack of spirit and asked if something was wrong. I denied it, but he saw through my pretense. I couldn't deceive him and ended up confessing everything since his collapse, including Mariana being Steve's affair partner. It was hard to say the words. I felt responsible, as Mariana's sister, for setting the stage for their affair. If I hadn't married Steve, none of this would have happened, and my father-in-law wouldn't be saddened. But he insisted it wasn't my fault. He said cheaters will cheat regardless of their partner, and they repeat their actions even when blamed. Moreover, an affair with one's wife's sister is unforgivable. He was so appalled by my husband's pathos that he doesn't even feel like getting angry at me, asking why he doesn't try to confront his jealousy that he's being neglected by something else. Already fed up, he was ready to cut ties with Steve. That's when I learned about Steve's past misdeeds, putting his position as future president in jeopardy. My father-in-law urged me to demand alimony and proceed with the divorce. But I shared my concern. If I demanded alimony, Steve threatened to cut ties with his father and quit the company.
Cut ties with me? Leave the company? I'd rather declare it myself.
He mentioned cut ties with Steve, but I knew it's not easy to sever family ties. No matter what the reason, it must take a lot of determination to cut ties with your family. If it were, I'd have cut ties with Mariana. After some thought, my father-in-law seemed to have made up his mind and made me a proposal. My father-in-law made a proposition that left me speechless. He told me to take my time deciding, and until then, he'd wait for the divorce papers. I decided to wait until then to file for divorce. I couldn't decide alone, so I consulted my parents. They supported any decision I made. Mariana's actions were unforgivable, and they too felt it was time to take a stand. After careful consideration, I accepted my father-in-law's offer. I informed him, then visited the lawyer and notified Steve. He was overjoyed, believing I'd followed through with our deal and not demanded alimony. He even ordered me to diligently care for his gracious father until the end. I could have spoken up now that I was no longer bound to Steve, but I chose to play along, following my father-in-law's plan to exact revenge on Steve and Mariana. That's why I decided not to argue and play the role of a useless woman who can't disobey her ex-husband. 2 years later, my father-in-law, who had been hoping to return to the company, passed away. I stayed by his side until his last breath. There were close calls, but he had overcome them. I believed he would pull through this time too, but the accumulated strain and his age took their toll. I informed Steve of the close calls, but he never showed up, dismissing them as not critical. I contacted Steve just before my father-in-law passed away. The doctors had said it was time to prepare for the worst. I urged him to visit while he could to avoid regrets, but he never came to the hospital. My father-in-law passed away surrounded by me and the company's executives. I had little time to mourn, as I had to arrange the funeral and notify people who had known him. The first person I had to inform was Steve, as the actual son. I told him about the death with a shaky voice, and this time, he asked detailed questions about where to go. I answered as best as I could. Then, Steve arrived at the family home with Mariana. Relatives' visits were the priority, followed by company associates. Many employees voluntarily helped behind the scenes. Steve seemed unaffected by his father's death. People grieve differently. Some cry openly, others remain stoic in public and grieve in private. So even though it looks like my ex-husband doesn't feel anything towards my father-in-law, I don't know what's going on in his heart. So, I thought best to leave Steve alone. But as I was about to leave, he stopped me.
Where are you going? I need to talk to you.
He blocked my way with a low, growling voice. Turning around, Steve claimed he would inherit the company and all the estate, and as an outsider, I should leave immediately. He even forbade me from attending the wake and funeral, ordering another employee to represent the company instead. I was surprised. But everything was unfolding just as my father-in-law had predicted. He had said Steve would certainly try to claim everything. I relayed the script my father-in-law had given me to Steve.
I'm not an outsider. After our divorce, your father adopted me as his heir.
Steve, in disbelief, began to panic.
How dare you do this without consulting me, his son? It's invalid. I don't need your permission to be adopted by your father. And now, I inherit everything.
When my father-in-law adopted me, a notary public prepared a will bequeathing everything to me. With his lawyer present. Steve knew the lawyer and could verify if he didn't believe me. My father-in-law had foreseen Steve's actions, and as expected, Steve realized I wasn't lying.
If you had visited your father even once, maybe things could have been different.
The likelihood was slim, but depending on Steve's redemption, he might have received some inheritance. Steve had no comeback and fell silent. But Mariana hadn't given up. Dredging up some knowledge she thought might be useful. She's always been quick-witted about such matters. I think my sister's life would have changed if she had used it for something else, but it might be too late. She claimed that even with a will, Steve was entitled to a forced share. I expected Steve to jump on this, but he just looked more uncomfortable and stayed silent. I knew why. My father-in-law had disowned Steve after he accumulated a massive debt as a bachelor, which my father-in-law had to pay off. The debt wasn't a few million but tens of millions of yen. When my father-in-law covered it, it wasn't without conditions. One was that Steve had to repay a set amount each month, interest-free. The other condition was giving up his right to a compulsory portion of the inheritance in lieu of repayment. Maybe Steve thought it didn't matter since he'd inherit anyway. He probably saw the debt write-off as more beneficial. I don't know his exact thoughts when he signed the waiver, but that meant Steve had no right to any compulsory portion. My father-in-law had lost patience with him, but he hadn't considered cutting ties with him yet. He hoped that a responsible wife and a family would make Steve more accountable and less dependent. That's when he noticed me. At first, he saw me just as a potential wife for Steve, but then he felt I had the qualities of a successor. He had hoped that marrying me would inspire Steve to grow, not drive him to jealousy, infidelity, and divorce. Steve kept silent as Mariana pressed him on why he wasn't responding. My ex-husband can't tell. He couldn't admit that he had signed away his rights due to short-sightedness and a desire for an easy way out. So I spoke for him. Mariana turned on Steve, accusing him of deceiving her.
You deceived me. I didn't deceive you. I never thought Dad would do something like this. You should have realized something was up with all the attention Dad gave to my sister. Why didn't you check before divorcing her?
As they started to argue at my father-in-law's funeral, I decided to interject.
Sorry to interrupt your heated argument, but I'm going to claim my emotional damages against both of you using the video I took on my phone.
I delivered the news lightly and cheerfully. It felt like a triumphant reversal. It's no good to let your emotions run wild. I knew that by looking at my sister. I should change my behavior after seeing how others behaved. I had a tendency to lose my emotions and be too serious. My sister, on the other hand, seems to be a person who lets her emotions dictate, but I thought her ex-husband was a moderate and pure person. I realized that my ex-husband and my sister were actually not that different from each other. I think it was easy for us to hit it off because we were similar people. My sister and ex-husband got into an even bigger fight when I announced that I was demanding compensation. However, I don't want to show any more ugliness in front of my father-in-law. I asked a young male employee to help me throw the two troublemakers outside. My ex-husband is my birthplace, what's the point of bashing him out? However, my housekeeper, who thought I was in danger as my sister and ex-husband approached me, contacted my father-in-law's lawyer, who in turn notified the police, and the police who rushed to the scene gave me a strict warning. Onlookers gathered from the neighborhood, and my sister and her ex-husband quickly left. By the way, I became even closer to the housekeeper that my father-in-law trusted and employed for many years after I became his adopted daughter. Even after her father-in-law passes away, she plans to continue working as a housekeeper as long as she has the strength to do so. After that, with the help of those around me, I completed my role as chief mourner. Executives praised the funeral, saying it was a rare and splendid funeral, and the conduct of the chief mourner. Since I had been preparing to take over as the next president, the company transition went smoothly. Being a female president, I became well known within the company, with no employee unaware of who I was. It's common in large companies for employees not to know the CEO's face. Our company, headquartered in Nebraska, has branches in other regions and subsidiaries. My father-in-law worked even during his hospitalization, buying struggling companies and improving their performance. As the company grew, it was natural for only the management to know the president. You might forget someone you met just once at an induction ceremony. I resolved to always remember my initial determination and unite the employees to build up the company. My father-in-law had started with the same intention but gradually lost it as the company expanded. When I was uncertain, my father-in-law always told me to go back to the basics and to listen to others' opinions but make decisions responsibly. He taught me many lessons from his successes and failures. Based on these, the first thing I did as president was to reorganize the staff. Though I only fired one person. Steve, who believed he would be the future president, had been misusing company funds. Even as president, the company's money isn't personal funds. He didn't even understand that basic principle. No matter how dire the circumstances, using company funds is absolutely unacceptable. However, I didn't want to dismiss someone without hearing their side, even if their reasons were trivial. It's better than acting rashly and dealing with complications later. Steve's excuse was pathetically inadequate. He wanted to live a luxurious life with Mariana. Apparently, he indulges every whim of hers.
She's all I have. What am I supposed to do if she leaves me? What's wrong with using the money for that?
He didn't even see the embezzlement as wrong, so I fired him without any sympathy. After that, Steve and Mariana had to work tirelessly every day to pay back what they embezzled and the damages to me. Mariana, who had always been carefree, was now doing grimy manual labor at 30. Initially, she complained about her nails and getting tanned, but now she's too exhausted to complain under her strict boss. Steve, once praised as the next president, now gets reprimanded even by new employees. Hey janitor, make sure to throw out the trash properly. By chance, his job at a cleaning company ended up being at his former workplace. It was lucky for me, as I could monitor their repayment. Thanks to the housekeeper, who agreed to continue her duties after my father-in-law's passing, I could focus on work without worrying about home. My current goal is further expansion and international outreach. While I may not have been suited for marriage, finding a fulfilling job has made this the most rewarding time of my life.